March 24, 1945, about 12:15, over Berlin, Germany. The air at 30,000 feet is a hostile environment, a realm where the temperature plummets to 60 degrees below zero, and the air is too thin to sustain human life without a mask. Here, the condensation trails of four-engine bombers stretch out like white scars against the blue, marking the path of the 15th Air Force deep into the heart of the Third Reich. This is the Big B, Berlin. The target is the Daimler-Benz Tank Works, the industrial muscle keeping the Wehrmacht alive in its final, desperate throes. Flying protective cover for the B-17 Flying Fortresses are the P-51 Mustangs of the 332nd Fighter Group. They are 6 hours into a grueling 1,600-mile round trip, a test of endurance that pushes both pilot and machine to their absolute limits. The pilots are cramped, freezing and running on adrenaline, scanning the horizon for the Luftwaffe. But the enemy that rises to meet them today is unlike anything they have trained to fight. These are not the propeller-driven Focke-Wulfs or Messerschmitt 109s of the early war years. They are Me-262s, twin-engine jets, shark-like and screaming through the formation at speeds nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the American Mustangs. The jets slash through the bomber stream, their 30 cannons tearing into the aluminum skin of the heavy bombers. For the pilots of the 332nd, the engagement is a chaotic blur of physics and instinct. To catch a jet with a piston-engine fighter requires perfect timing and aggressive geometry. You cannot chase them, you must cut them off. Amidst the flak and the chaos, the Mustangs roll and dive. By the time the engagement breaks off, 3 of the German jets have been shot down, smoking ruins falling toward the Brandenburg Plain. The 332nd Fighter Group, the men inside those cockpits, have just gone toe-to-toe with the cutting edge of German technology and won. They will earn a distinguished unit citation for this mission, a testament to their discipline and lethality. But to understand the significance of those 3 kills over Berlin, one cannot simply look at the gun camera footage of 1945. You have to look back at the runway at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, 4 years prior. You have to understand the sheer improbability of these men being in the air at all. The road to air superiority was paved with obstruction long before it was paved with tarmac. In January 1941, when the civilian pilot training program began at the Tuskegee Institute, the prevailing wisdom in the War Department, supported by a biased 1925 Army War College study, was that African Americans lacked the technical aptitude and the courage to fly military aircraft. The formation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron on March 22, 1941, was viewed by many in the command structure not as a combat asset, but as an experiment expected to fail. The first class of pilots, graduating in March 1942, consisted of only 5 men. Among them was Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a West Point graduate who had endured 4 years of silence from his fellow cadets, a man whose steel will would become the backbone of the entire program. Davis understood what the young pilots arriving in Alabama did not yet fully grasp. They were fighting 2 wars. One was against fascism in Europe, the other was against racism at home. A single mistake, a single washed-out landing or disciplinary infraction would be used as ammunition to shut the entire program down. Perfection was not just a goal, it was a survival strategy. By April 1943, the 99th Pursuit Squadron deployed to North Africa. They were not given the glamour of the high-altitude escort missions immediately. They were assigned P-40 Warhawks, rugged, heavy aircraft that were already becoming obsolete against the nimble German fighters. They flew ground attack missions, strafing supply trucks and rail lines, learning the trade of war in the dusty, hot air of the Mediterranean theater. Their first combat mission on June 2, 1943, against the island of Pantelleria, was a strafing run. It was unglamorous, dangerous work, flying low into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire. The learning curve was steep. In the skies over Sicily and Italy, the pilots of the 99th faced seasoned Luftwaffe veterans. There were losses. There were tactical errors. Critics back in Washington seized on these early growing pains, attempting to have the squadron removed from combat duty. But Davis defended his men with the same stoicism he applied to his command, citing the lack of experience compared to white units that had been in theater longer. He bought them time. And with time came proficiency. By February 1944, the scope of the Tuskegee experiment expanded dramatically. The 99th was joined by the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons to form the 332nd Fighter Group. They were now a force to be reckoned with, a complete fighter group under the command of Colonel Davis. They arrived in Italy just as the air war was shifting gears. The Allies were pushing hard to dismantle German industry from the air, and the 15th Air Force needed escorts who could stay with the bombers all the way to the target. The 332nd transitioned through aircraft as the war progressed, moving from the P-40 to the P-39 Air Acobra, a mid-engine fighter with a powerful 37 cannon in the nose that pilots often found temperamental, before graduating to the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt, affectionately known as the Jug, was a massive, 7-ton beast of a machine, built like a flying tank and armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns. It was in these rugged airframes that the 332nd began to carve out a reputation not just for survival, but for aggressive tactical precision. On June 25, 1944, the pilots of the 332nd demonstrated that their lethality was not limited to air-to-air combat. The target was Trieste Harbor in northern Italy, a vital logistical hub for the Axis forces. While the primary directive was often escort, the P-47s were opportunistic hunters when unleashed on ground or naval targets. In the harbor sat the Giuseppe Missari, an Italian destroyer that had been seized by the Germans and reclassified as the torpedo boat Ta-22. For a fighter group to engage a warship was a proposition fraught with danger. The volume of anti-aircraft fire a destroyer could put up was withering. Yet, the Red Tails dove. They strafed the vessel with a torrent of lead, their heavy machine guns raking the deck and hull. It was a relentless assault that pierced the ship's boilers and ignited its fuel stores. The vessel burned and eventually sank, a rare distinction for fighter pilots, adding a naval kill to their record. This action underscored the versatility of the group. They were destroying the enemy on the ground and at sea, eventually tallying over 950 rail cars, trucks, and other motor vehicles destroyed by the war's end. However, the defining chapter of the Tuskegee Airmen's legacy was written in the cockpit of the North American P-51 Mustang. By June 1944, the 332nd had transitioned to this premier escort fighter. To distinguish themselves in the chaotic swarm of bomber formations, the ground crews painted the tails of the aircraft a distinct, vibrant crimson. They became the Red Tails, a moniker that would soon echo through the barracks of bomber crews across Italy. The bomber crews, men who watched their friends die by the hundreds in the freezing skies over Europe, began to call them the Red Tail Angels. There is a long-standing myth, circulated for decades in post-war retellings, that the Tuskegee Airmen never lost a single bomber under their protection to enemy fire. It is a compelling story, one that fits the narrative of perfection required to defeat racism, but the historical reality is more complex and, in many ways, more impressive for its truth. War is a game of probabilities, not absolutes. Air Force historical research confirms that 27 bombers escorted by the 332nd were shot down by enemy aircraft over the course of 7 different mission dates. The first of these losses occurred on June 9, 1944, during a mission to Udine, Italy. It was their first escort mission with the 15th Air Force. The Luftwaffe was still a potent force, and the sky was a swirling melee of fighters. The 332nd pilots fought fiercely, shooting down 5 enemy aircraft to protect their charges. Despite their efforts, 2 B-24 Liberators took heavy fire and went down. But to focus on the loss of 27 bombers is to miss the statistical miracle of their performance. The average number of bombers lost by other P-51 escort groups in the 15th Air Force was 46. The Red Tails were nearly twice as effective as the average group. They achieved this not by chasing glory, but by adhering to a strict discipline instilled by Colonel Davis: stay with the bombers. While other fighter groups might peel off to chase German fighters and rack up personal kill counts, the 332nd stayed close, weaving a protective net around the heavy bombers. This discipline was tested in fire on July 18, 1944. The target was Memmingen, Germany. The 332nd was escorting the B-17s of the 483rd Bombardment Group. The Luftwaffe rose in force to meet them. It was a massive, sprawling dogfight involving dozens of aircraft twisting through the contrails. The German strategy was to draw the fighters away and then slash through the unguarded bomber stream. The Red Tails refused to take the bait. They engaged the enemy only when they threatened the big friends. In the ensuing battle, the 332nd was credited with shooting down 9 German fighters in a single day. The 483rd Bombardment Group suffered heavy losses from the sheer volume of enemy interceptors, but without the Red Tails' intervention, the devastation would have been total. By the spring of 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen had flown over 15,000 combat sorties. They had destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in the air and another 150 on the ground, strafing airfields, where the Luftwaffe tried to hide its dwindling fleet. But while the 332nd was dismantling the Wehrmacht in Europe, another battle was brewing back in the United States, one that would not be fought with machine guns, but with the uniform code of military justice. The 477th Bombardment Group, the bomber counterpart to the 332nd, was training stateside, preparing to deploy B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. They were stationed at Freeman Army Airfield in Indiana. The war in Europe was winding down, but the structure of American society remained rigidly segregated. At Freeman Field, there were 2 officers' clubs. One was designated for trainees, which was a thinly veiled code for the African American officers. The other fully equipped club was for instructors, meaning the white officers. On April 5, 1945, just 2 weeks after their brethren in the 332nd had tangled with jets over Berlin, the officers of the 477th decided to challenge this order. It was a coordinated, nonviolent protest. Small groups of African American officers, including a young navigator named Second Lieutenant Coleman A. Young, who would later become the mayor of Detroit, attempted to enter the White Officers Club. They were turned away. They returned. They were ordered to sign a regulation stating they understood the club was segregated. They refused. The base commander responded with a heavy hand. Over the course of 2 days, 101 African American officers were arrested for refusing to sign the regulation. This event, known as the Freeman Field Mutiny, was a watershed moment. These were men commissioned by the President of the United States, trained to fly complex machinery of war, yet treated as second-class citizens on the very bases where they prepared to die for their country. They were facing court-martial not for cowardice or incompetence, but for demanding the respect their rank entitled them to. While the 332nd was proving black men could fly, the 477th was proving black men would no longer accept the status quo. The mutiny did not result in combat sorties, but it laid the groundwork for the desegregation of the military 3 years later. Back in the European theater, the war was rushing toward its conclusion. On April 26, 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen claimed their final aerial victories of the war, shooting down the last 4 enemy aircraft destroyed in the Mediterranean theater of operations. By the time the guns fell silent, the 332nd Fighter Group had etched a record of performance that no amount of prejudice could erase. The final tally of their contribution to the European theater was a mathematical rebuke to the 1925 Army War College study that had labeled them unfit. Over the course of the war, the Tuskegee Airmen flew 15,533 combat sorties. They did not merely occupy airspace, they dominated it. While their primary fame was born from the bomber escort missions, of which they flew 179 for the 15th Air Force, their impact was felt just as heavily on the ground. As the Luftwaffe's presence in the sky diminished in the final weeks of the war, the mission profile shifted. The P-51 Mustangs, designed for high-altitude dogfighting, were turned downward, becoming instruments of tactical air support. The pilots of the 332nd prowled the German countryside, hunting for targets of opportunity. They destroyed 150 enemy aircraft on the ground, catching the remnants of the German Air Force before they could even taxi to the runway. But the destruction went beyond aviation. The Red Tails dismantled the logistical spine of the retreating German army, destroying over 950 rail cars, trucks, and other motor vehicles. Every train engine exploded, and every supply truck strafed was a delay in the Wehrmacht's ability to maneuver, directly aiding the Allied ground advance into the heart of Germany. This operational tempo required a massive, synchronized effort that extended far beyond the cockpit. While the 992 pilots who graduated from the Tuskegee program between 1941 and 1946 became the face of the Tuskegee experience, they were the tip of a very large spear. Behind every lieutenant adjusting his oxygen mask was a ground crew of mechanics, armorers, meteorologists, and supply officers who worked around the clock to keep the aircraft combat-ready. Approximately 190 support personnel, including mechanics, nurses, and cooks, who were part of the Tuskegee experience. These men and women served in the same segregated army as the pilots, enduring the same indignities while performing tasks essential to the war effort. Consider the mechanic standing on the pierced steel planking of a runway in Ramitelli, Italy. It is a cold morning in early 1945. His hands are covered in grease and freezing mud as he wrenches on the Allison or Merlin engine of a P-51. He knows that the pilot who climbs into this cockpit, a man he likely knows by name, a man he eats with and bunks near, is relying entirely on his mechanical perfection to survive. If a fuel line clogs or a hydraulic seal fails at 25,000 feet, that pilot is dead. The bond between the ground crews and the air crews of the 332nd was forged in this crucible of absolute reliance. They were a closed ecosystem, isolated by the color line, forced to rely on each other because they could not always rely on the system that sent them there. The pilots got the glory and the headlines in the African-American press, but the ground crews ensured the Red Tails could actually get off the ground to earn them. The cost of this excellence was high. While the 332nd was racking up victories, the telegrams were still being sent home to mothers in Chicago, New York, and the Deep South. 68 Tuskegee Airmen were killed in action or in accidents during their combat deployment. The Mediterranean theater was unforgiving. A pilot could be lost to a sudden storm over the Alps, a mechanical failure over the Adriatic, or the terrifying wall of flak that protected German industrial targets. Furthermore, 32 pilots were shot down and captured, held as prisoners of war. For a black aviator, parachuting into Nazi-controlled territory carried a unique terror. They were falling into the hands of a regime founded on the concept of Aryan supremacy, a regime that viewed them not just as enemies, but as subhuman. Yet these men maintained their bearing and their honor even behind the barbed wire of the stalags, waiting for liberation that was inching closer with every mission they had flown. As the spring of 1945 turned toward summer, the Third Reich was collapsing. The 332nd Fighter Group continued to press the attack until the very last moments of the conflict. On April 26, 1945, just days before Hitler's suicide and the final German surrender, the Tuskegee Airmen engaged enemy aircraft for the last time. In a sweeping engagement that served as a coda to their combat record, they shot down 4 enemy planes. These were the last 4 enemy aircraft destroyed in the Mediterranean theater of operations. It was a fitting end to their combat narrative, fighting until the whistle blew, ensuring that the heavy bombers could deliver the final death blows to the Third Reich with a level of security that was statistically unmatched. But to fully grasp the lethality and the discipline of the 332nd in these final weeks, one must rewind the clock just slightly to a mission that would become the centerpiece of their combat record, a mission that tested the limits of both pilot endurance and machine capability. It was March 24, 1945. The target was Berlin. By this stage of the war, the Luftwaffe was a broken force. But it was a broken force armed with desperation and the most advanced aeronautical technology the world had ever seen. The objective for the 15th Air Force was the Daimler-Benz tank factory, a sprawling industrial complex churning out the armor that was still killing Allied troops on the ground. For the bombers, it was a deep penetration strike into the heart of the enemy capital. For the fighter escorts of the 332nd, it was a grueling test of stamina, a 1,600-mile round trip. To fly a P-51 Mustang for that duration is a physical ordeal that is difficult to overstate. The cockpit is tight, a metal sarcophagus where the pilot is strapped in over a 1,700 horsepower engine that vibrates through every bone in his body. At 25,000 feet, the air temperature outside is 50 degrees below zero. Even with flight suits and cockpit heating, the cold gnaws at the extremities. The oxygen mask, a rubber vise on the face, chafes the skin raw after hours of use. A pilot cannot stretch, cannot stand, and cannot relax his vigilance for a single second. On this Saturday morning, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., led his group into the gray skies over Germany. The Red Tails were shepherding the B, flying fortresses, the Big Friends, through a gauntlet of flak and enemy interceptors. As they approached the outskirts of Berlin, the clock ticked toward 12:15 hours. The bomber stream was a massive, slow-moving river of aluminum, and the P-51s wove their protective patterns around them. Then, the threat materialized. It wasn't the familiar silhouette of the Mi-109 or the FW-190. These shapes were sleek, shark-like, and they moved with a speed that defied the physics of propeller-driven flight. They were Messerschmitt Mi-262s, the world's first operational jet fighters. The Mi-262 was a predator from the future, screaming through the formation at speeds nearly 100 miles an hour faster than the Mustangs could muster. Despite this terrifying technological mismatch, the Red Tails turned to engage, pitting their maneuverability and grit against the raw power of the jet age. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.